Hello BookTube, this is a video I hadn't anticipated making because I am wrapping up all 6 books on the shortlist for the Goldsmith prize. I wasn't expecting to do it because I don't really follow prizes that closely, but when the shortlist came out I realised that I'd read 2 of them. I had another one which I hadn't got to yet. On the basis of reading about the competition, I thought there were a couple, there was one that I liked the sound of and I ordered that, and I didn't realise that I had another one on the list that I didn't realise had made the list, so that made 5 of the 6. I thought, well, I may as well go all in and get the 6th. So I'm going to rank them, having read them all, I'm going to rank them from 6 up to 1 in terms of which I would like to see win. Just to say that the Goldsmith prize is a prize for innovative fiction. Now I'm going to post in the show notes my link to a video of mine called, I can't remember exactly what it's called, but it's something about what makes experimental fiction. Because I think the notions of experimental fiction, innovative fiction are a bit redundant really. It's incredibly hard to be innovative, truly innovative, that someone else hasn't done before. That's not to say that it can't be jolting and surprising, but I think in general people confuse the word experimental or innovative with unconventional, that it's not the normal type of book that they read, formally or linguistically, but that doesn't make it innovative. It just means they haven't read other books that do similar. So in a way, I think this prize is a complete misnomer, because from the recent winners, and I can't say I've read every book on every shortlist, but from the winners certainly, I can't think of a genuinely innovative book going back 3-4 years that's won it. But that's, I'm not knocking literary prizes. I mean, books and authors need what support they can get. I'm just saying in this case, if it was to be judged purely on innovative fiction, then none of them would win. But having said that, I do have a clear hierarchy of preference from my own reading of this year's list. Okay, so in 6th place is Tale by Jonathan Buckley. And this is a faux biography. And in my last video, and again I'll post a link to it, we've had an absolute rash of these types of books which sort of are faux biographies or using the form of memoir, or but it's really a work of fiction. So straight away, this has been done to death in recent years. But, that doesn't mean that Buckley can't try and do something different with it. And I think in one particular respect he tries. But other than that, what you get here really is an actual biography of a fictional person. And with that in mind, it's not terribly interesting. So I put it down as number 6, the least innovative and the least interesting, the least engaging. So it's the story or the biography of a self-made billionaire who has retreated to the wilds of Scotland and built this sort of mansion and an estate which is sort of populated by servants, and he's disappeared and he's presumed dead. And there are 2 biographical treatments of him. One is a formal written literary biography by a woman called Lara, but this version, the one presented here, is actually a film biography that's going to be made of his life, and we're getting someone from the film production unit who is interviewing one of the witnesses, who happens to be the gardener on the estate. And over the course of 5 interviews, which is the course of this book, this woman sort of reveals everything she knows about the man. So you have a unity of voice, unlike, say, Hernan Diaz's Trust, where you have 4 different voices sort of narrowing in on the same one biographical subject. Here it is one singular narrative voice. However, she's a gardener. She had limited interaction with her boss because he, unlike his wife, was not particularly into the garden. She had much more interaction with his late wife because they would hold conversations about nature and the garden, etc, etc, etc. So a lot of the material that she provides is second-hand, it's hearsay, because obviously she swaps stories and gossip with the other staff, There were other members of the subject's family and business partners and friends and an art dealer who she had varying degrees of contact with. Those that liked to be outside, taking the view, looking at the gardens, she had more contact with than others who didn't. So I think the point of the fact that so much of her words are hearsay, I think the point of this book, and it's such a trite point that a lot of these faux biographies make, is it's really hard to pin down the singularity of a human being. We all have masks. We all present different facets of ourselves in different social and personal and professional situations. That is not terribly revelatory, and it's certainly not innovative. So the two other things I want to say about this book, one is that this woman, this gardener, she is class-bound compared with the subject matter. He although he's sort of from I think he was from a bourgeois background, he has sort of ascended into the uber-rich, and with all the sort of accoutrements and values and attitudes that comes with that. She's a humble gardener. And sometimes when she's sort of relaying her material to the film crew, she tries to sort of illustrate it, like we all do, by putting in a comparison or a simile or a reference to something in the news that echoes it or gives it context or underpins it or whatever. But the problem is, I think because of the way she's been written as this sort of, lesser class person, they're trite, they're boring, they are non-revelatory other than to her own limited horizon. I mean, she's a gardener. This isn't Being There, the Peter Sellers movie. So unfortunately, not only am I not interested in the story of a self-made billionaire, because I'm not interested in that type of character, the story is told in a really dull fashion by this woman whose world vision is rather limited. And that comes across in when she does sort of break out into references and comparisons. So all in all, this book is absolutely unengaging. Now, I did say it had one innovative streak, and that is periodically in the text, it will pause. It says pause as the woman sort of pauses for breath. It also periodically says inaudible, and it also periodically says indecipherable. Presumably, because playing it back on the tape, the film person couldn't make out exactly what was being said by this woman. And to my mind, the first thing is that in that case, inaudible and indecipherable amount to the same thing, because for you to declare something as inaudible, you must be able to hear something. Otherwise, you wouldn't know what you were listening to, that there was something to be heard, even if you couldn't make out what it was, which makes it the same as indecipherable. But, that's maybe a petty thing. The point about all biographies, if you're encapsulating a single life from cradle to grave, or near grave, it's most of the material is historical. It's stuff that happened to that person in the past. It's incidents, it's events, it's stories, it's flashbacks if the person themselves are being interviewed. And I think by his device of inaudible, pause and indecipherable, he's trying to get around the fact that all this is in the past. He's trying to make it in the now. But the problem, of course, is it isn't, because it's a taped recording of this woman speaking on 5 different occasions, being played back. So it's already happened. So that sort of trying to manipulate time to sort of make it seem in the now doesn't work. So for me, this book failed on every single level. 2 stars. And on to Neel Mukerjee, choice. So I think this book would claim to be innovative because it's 3 novella length or short story length stories that are loosely related by theme. But I mean, that ain't innovative. I mean, my book, Stories We Tell Our Children, was 31 thematically linked stories, but there's nothing innovative about it. So the first story is a gay couple have adopted 4-year-old twins, and one of the men is he works in publishing. He's of Indian descent. and he very much feels like there's a sort of token non-white skin in the world of publishing in his company. He does get to commission a few writers, but I think the best thing about this part one is he's so scathing about the way publishing works, and it's all about, you know, sales teams, not creativity. It's all about the bottom line. It's about margins rather than any artistic merit. And it, as a writer, I found it very entertaining, very on the nail. But he's not just at war with his job, he's at war with the whole world, because he's terribly distressed by the looming environmental crisis. He's trying to make changes at home to save energy and conserve things, and he wants to introduce to his kids, so that, and I think this is a really important thing that doesn't really get talked about enough, that, you know, if you have children, and this couple have battled really hard to have children, they've had to adopt. If you have children, you want to have heritage to pass on to them, not just things from you and your family and maybe your work. You want a planet left for them to live on. And that's his desperate concern. He's very, very sort of discomforted by what's happening. Unfortunately, in some ways, he takes this too far, because at age 4, he shows them a film about abattoirs because he wants to make them vegetarian. And straight away, you can see the conflict between his view of the world and his partner's, because his partner is a lecturer in economics, very much sort of scientific, detached evaluations of everything, the commodity value of everything, and, you know, a view of the world that absolutely underpins capitalism as well. There's no better alternative. So there's a slight sort of charm in me that goes, well, how did these two guys really get together and stay together? And indeed, some of the character work very early on I thought was a bit clunky. It was a bit obvious to my writerly eye why Mukerjee had put that in there, because it's sort of info dump. I mean, it's not crassly done, but to my eye, I still spotted it. But actually, as the story wore on, you know, it was much more seamless. But there is this sort of fundamental conflict between these two men in their relationship as to how they're going to bring up their children. And I did think the bits with the kids were possibly the best. One of them is sort of OCD. One is sort of frightened of their own shadow. So I did think the bits with the kids were actually very well done. But it didn't nail its landing. And indeed, of the 3 stories, 2 of them failed to nail their landings. And that was a big problem. So that really tore away whatever I was feeling up to you know, coming to the end of that story. It did ultimately fall flat because of its ending. Obviously, I won't spoil it for you. The second story is a woman who is a university lecturer in sort of medieval romanticism, and she's coming back from a dinner party in an Uber because she's had too much to drink, and they hit a boy walking a dog for some reason in the middle of the road, and the driver doesn't stop, and she realises that it's not the name that she's not the photo of the driver that she was sent. It turns out to be his brother, and this guy explains that, well, my brother is sick, he's got bad kidneys, for the family's sake we need the money, so even though I'm not licensed with Uber, I took it up. So she's wrangling with herself. Should she report, you know, this hit and run? She doesn't know what's happened to the boy. There seems to be no news about it. But instead, she starts to form a relationship, not a sexual relationship, not even a friendship, because their worlds are so alien, with this fake Uber driver. He's a migrant. He came over in the boats. He was from Eritrea, where he was enlisted into the army to fight the civil war there. Not the civil war, the war against Ethiopia there, and sort of managed to bounce from place to place to place until he's ended up in the UK. And in doing so, she becomes very sort of taken with the idea of sort of writing about migrants and the small boats and stuff, and is moving away from her sort of medieval romanticism, and actually asks for a leave of absence to write the story. But of course, it's not her story to tell. She's basically leeching off this guy as she gradually opens him up to sort of tell more and more of his story. So I didn't find her character work A, very convincing, and B, very appealing. She is a parasite, really, or a leech, and I didn't find the character work well done because I couldn't really ever get to grips with her, who she was, and why would she move from, you know, her safe tenure of sort of medieval romanticism into this without it really ever being psychologically justified, I felt. So that was the weakest of all three stories, even though it nailed its ending, ironically.
Although, just to say that I guessed the twist, I suppose, which fed into the ending. From quite early on in the story, it's sort of that Chekhovian principle that if a gun is introduced on stage in Act 1, you know it's going to be used in the final act, and there's definitely an element of that here.
And then on to the third story, which was the best of the lot, because it was of a village in India where there was a government or a local state government initiative to provide the poorest people in the village with a cow for free, which was something that was referred to in the very first story. And why it's the best is because it's a fantastic portrait of grinding rural poverty in India. It's really well done, really well described. And this cow causes as many problems as it's promised to solve, because it takes time to graze it, it takes time to milk it eventually. In the monsoon you can't graze it, and in the heat of the summer, height of the summer, there's no grass left to grow. So there's all sorts of problems that suck this poor. She's basically a cleaner, that's what she does, but she's able to spend less and less time because of the time suck of looking after this cow. And, you know, she rages against the people who provided the cow because they haven't thought it through. She stirs up lots of jealousies of the rest of the people around her because she has a cow and they don't. And I think it's a real sort of eye-opening image. She actually sort of, because she can't house clean for the two houses, she only has time for one. She basically pimps out her daughter to, when I say pimp, I don't mean sexually. She pimps out her daughter to do the cleaning. And her daughter's only about 11, I think. So I did think that was really well done, but the ending, again, just misses by a country mile. So nothing innovative, very mixed bag in its writing. Some of the character work I felt wasn't very good. Two of the three endings were missed. Definitely some really good things about it, but ultimately I gave it 3 out of 5. And on to the next book, which is in my shed, which will give you an idea of what I feel about it. And it's Rachel Cusk's Parade. So I have a difficult relationship with Rachel Cusk anyway. One of the things she's accused of is being intellectual and detached and remote, emotionally remote in her writing. But funnily enough, in the first 2 sections of the 4 sections of Parade, she isn't at all. She's writing about artists or an artist's wife, and we get this sort of quite sort of seductive, oozing with desire, jealousy of an artist when thinking about whether other men would, find his wife attractive. You get several children of a sort of a tyrant of a mother, as the mother has died, and they're all sort of reacting to that with sort of fierce emotional reactions. So, you know, they're in the first 2 sections of this book, I was utterly swept into the book. I had lots of interesting things to say about art and lots of interesting things to say about relationships. The last 2 sections are a reversion to type. So the thing about Cusk is she's innovative in one sense because no one else writes the type of book she does. But they're almost, to me, Cusk seems to write, or the latter sort of Cusk books seem to be deliberately sabotaging her own sort of work and her own métier. Because after a really promising start in the first 2 sections, we have 2 really uninvolving sections. The third section is a dinner party, albeit it takes place outdoors. and more people sort of, it's a whole group of people who are part of guests to an art launch, and as they sort of leave the gallery there, or the museum, they see these other people and they sit down, but all it is an intellectual discussion. And I ought to have said in the Mukerjee, in the part one, in the where the two fathers are arguing about which direction to take the upbringing of their children, they're just intellectual debates. And interestingly, Mukerjee acknowledges this formally in part of his diatribe against publishing, where he says there are books of ideas, where all people are doing is setting down ideas, you know, battling it out with each other as if it was a Twitter argument and stuff. So he sort of admits his own Achilles heel in doing it, and Cusk unfortunately does it in that part 3. And then part 4 is two characters united by grief as they both have very sick elderly parents in their deathbeds. But it just didn't do anything for me at all. And what credit she built up with me in the first part of the book had absolutely dissipated with the second half of the book. I don't know what she was trying to achieve. As I say, to me, the only innovative thing about Cusk, other than writing Cusk-like books, is how she sabotages them. Very bizarre. 3 stars. And on to number 3, Mark Bowles, All My Precious Madness. So the first blurb on the back of this is by Stephen Mitchellmore, who is acknowledged in the back as having read an early draft of this. So Mitchellmore says, the best debut I've read in at least a decade. Anyone who has wished for an English Bernhard, as in Thomas Bernhard, need look no further. Now, this Bowles ain't no Thomas Bernhard. First of all, to say I really enjoyed this book, but he's no Thomas Bernhard. I mean, the comparison is the rage and the fury at one's culture and one's country. But he doesn't have the poetic and artistic use of language and repetition that Bernhard has. Also, the protagonist's voice in here is very critical of Wittgenstein, although he does admire Glenn Gould. And Wittgenstein and Gould are two of the very, very limited entries into Bernhard's exclusive pantheon. So, I understand why he might have said that, but I actually think it's lazy thinking to say this is an English Thomas Bernhard. It isn't. But once you sort of scrape that away, I found this very enjoyable. I will say it's very male. It is dealing with intellectual ideas. You know, it's talking about Wittgenstein, Thomas Adorno, is it Thomas or Theodore? Adorno, Guy Debord and Gilles Deleuze. So there's a bit about sort of literary fiction, but I think it was skillfully worked in. It did remind me of Laurent Binet's book, The Seventh Functional Language, which is one of my favourite books. But the difference there is Binet is highly creative in how he sort of sneaks in the sort of the high-powered philosophy and intellectualism of French thinkers like Deleuze and Debord. Whereas here, again, a bit like the Mukerjee and a bit like Section 3 of the Cusk, it is sort of someone just explaining other people's intellectual ideas. I mean, sometimes with an interesting take, don't get me wrong, it is original. It's not just rote repetition. Anyway, so the character is someone working class from Bradford in Yorkshire who gets a place to Oxford and has his eyes opened to the finer things in life by the sort of more middle class people of Oxford. So there's all sorts of sources of rage. There's rage at his own upbringing and its limitation that he never knew this other world existed. But there's equally rage at the posh boys and girls that he encounters at Oxford who, you know, are from a different world, have no understanding of his world and where he's from. There's also rage at himself, that he's being pretentious by aspiring to join these people. So there's lots of rage in this character. And there's lots of rage in him because his father was, you know, hit him, was sort of quite violent, readily resorted to violence. Eventually he has a breakdown, doesn't complete his doctorate in literature, comes back to London which is the sort of the real time of this book. But there's lots of flashbacks and recalling back to his past. And that's pretty much all it is, until towards the end you realise this is a grief memory. His father has died. But his father had a breakdown himself before death and emerged through it as a changed person. The violence had gone, it replaced it with love and enjoying life, which I thought was a bit sentimental, I have to say. But when you know, it is a grief, that sentimentality has emerged from grief. That's his way of processing grief, the death of his father, but acknowledging that his father was a changed man towards the end. So, you know, not much happens. It's an interesting overview. It's an interesting life. It is very male. It is very, when I say it's very, he's an intellectual person. I'm not saying the book is overly intellectual. I don't think it is. And just to give you an example, as I say, of how other people's ideas are presented. So this is where three speakers are at an academic conference. The third paper, the one after mine, was by a man called Andrew Mellon, whose talk, Unnameable Women, concerned the, quote, absence of women in various texts by Samuel Beckett, a paper which had no relevance to the conference title. To give him credit, he was taking a risk in criticising Beckett, who was generally beyond reproach, a kind of literary saint with an ethically impeccable war record, and Irish to boot. Anyway, I'm angry that there are no women in these texts, he declared as his coda, suddenly rubicund, his lips quivering, but as Beckett knew, there are neither men nor women in the text, only creatures of language, incomplete and asexual, sans genitalia, often bodiless. Voices as flickering and intermittent as a radio signal in a remote dwelling. A point I put to Mellon after his paper, but he was, so he said, too angry to answer. So I did enjoy this. Nothing innovative about it, unless you consider the actual ideas that he was dealing with and the literary theory and stuff. But they're all ideas that are in circulation anyway. But, you know, I enjoyed the read. 4 stars. And on to number 2. Hans Smith, Portraits at the Palace of Creativity and Wrecking. So this is a story basically alluding to contemporary Russia and how it has whitewashed certain historical facts from its history, recent history, such as the gulags, the labour camps, and how that any chance of activism today, so for example if there was a youth movement of protest and resistance to Putin, is, you know, has the life crushed out of it by Putin's security forces and the FSB. So a 14-year-old girl in a town that grew up because of the labour camps, because of the people who were brought to that area. She feels very out of sorts. She doesn't feel normal, and she pursues 2 twin tracks of activity to try and discover who she is, to try and sort of make her re-entry back into the world. One is sort of quite conventional with 2 of her female schoolmates. They're going to try and break into modelling, glamour modelling, and there are these sort of periodic sort of events where talent spotters come to these towns to see if they can pick up the next model. And they realise that they have to train for it. So they do this rigorous self-imposed exercise regime. They watch YouTube videos for all the sort of facial expressions and what to do with their arms and how to walk and all this sort of stuff. And they, you know, club together for portfolios. And it's interesting because there's still that sort of mean girl gang, you know, who's in, even though there's only 3 of them. There's a definite leader, and then the other 2 are sort of vying for position. But our heroine here, she's not really vying. Sometimes she's promoted because the other one is demoted in the affections of the leader. And of course, as they make a bit of progress on the journey to being models, it gets they sort of come across and interact with sleazy men. So that's one track. The other track is a new girl at school who's been thrown out of her previous school and is always outside the headmaster's study being ticked off for something or other, who exerts this strange pull on her. And it turns out that this girl is part of this movement, this activist movement, to restore the past as a means of shining a light upon similar methods of the current government. And so these 2 paths, she doesn't fit easily into either of them, but she's battling really hard to try and get with the programme with both. The language is fabulous. There's another character who she visits periodically, who's completely mentally gone. She's, she's fractured her mind. But gradually, through their sort of communication, she's knitting together slowly enough to at least be able to communicate, and that she was basically a victim of the camps, that she lost her child in the camp who died. And I just think it's wonderful. The language, as I say, it gave me vibes from Milkman, the Anna Burns novel, and if you're doing that, you've got to be doing something right. So I gave this 5 stars. Terrific read. And finally, my favourite, and I hope it wins, although if Portraits won, I'd have no problem with that either. Laura Pawson, Spent Night. So this is an example of one of those, as was this, to some extent as well, to be fair, an example of a book that jolts you, that you're not expecting it. In some places it's vertiginous. That, to me, is always good for a reading experience. And it starts off with a woman who is married, and her elderly next-door neighbour gives her this sort of jazzy toaster because he no longer needs it because his wife has died. And from this spiral off all sorts of associations of technology, of exploitative labour in the third world, of colonialism, of wars, of migration. It's just so brilliantly done because you get from the mundane to this sort of global through 2 or 3 images, and it's all done through images. It's not didactic, it's not preachy, it's just a set of associations of how everything, like a sort of blossoming flower or a network of their roots, you always end up back in these places of exploitation and conflict and manipulation. It's just brilliant. It's, I will leave the link to my longer review of it because this is the book I read earliest of all these books, and I can't, go into the detail now. It's just better if you're genuinely interested, if you go and watch my fuller review of it. So this was a 5-star read, and I hope it wins. So there you have it. That is my review of the Goldsmith Prize. None of the books genuinely innovative, but like I say, I don't believe any book can be genuinely innovative. 3 were good reads, 2 5-stars and 1 4 read. 1 was lamentable, 1 was just not very good, and Rachel Cusk is Rachel Cusk, doing Rachel Cusk things. Okay, till next time, thanks very much.